Hi.
And you find that most of the time you can't actually do risk without properly looking at governance. And then also you can't achieve a proper risk culture without internal controls and checks to basically see how well we are implementing the risk management framework, which now is the compliance bit. So governance looks at, number one, the overall strategy of the organization. So here we're looking at the top management, the board, and basically the very critical arms of the organization sitting together and planning what is our 5-year plan now, based on the model of our business, based on the market, based on the risks and opportunities that have presented themselves in the market. So basically looking at that, you come up with a risk, or you come up with a strategy that then encompasses the vision of the company for years to come, and provides direction for all organizations that this is where we're heading towards. These are the goals that we aim to achieve in these 5 years. Say, for example, we would like to implement an enterprise risk management framework. If it's an organization that conducts audit, we would also like to automate our audit process and maybe onboard a system such as Teammate to help with the auditing and so on and so forth. So that becomes your strategic vision. And then also incorporated in governance is business processes. So again, once you have the strategy, you want to have now businesses, or rather processes, that are going to support implementation of this strategy. Yeah. So look at business processes, and I guess that's why you find that we have standard operating procedures for the different departments in an organization. So you'll find that we have standard operating procedures for procurement, standard operating procedures for finance, standard operating procedures for business development, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And then also, apart from having standard operating procedures that are general to a department, we go down further into policies and procedures that address very specific components. Okay. Eve, you're calling me.
Sorry, I wanted to ask if you could share your slides.
Oh, I wasn't sharing the entire time.
Unless it's myself alone. Okay, yes, I can.
Okay, there. Oh, shit, I'm so sorry. Okay, great. So then coming back to what you were talking about. So after looking at business processes, we also have policies and procedures that are very specific to particular components of the organization. So you could have the information security policy, for example, which is a very overarching policy that speaks about the objectives of the organization and the commitment of the organization as far as information security is concerned. We're committed to making sure that all endpoints are adequately protected against malware infection. So that means that we have to get an endpoint antivirus and so on and so forth. We're committed to making sure that staff are well trained as far as information security is concerned, and we have a training and awareness program that is going to address these different aspects of information security threats and how staff can better protect the organization's information. Again, now that goes into policies and procedures. So they will speak to what an organization intends to do as far as specific processes are concerned. And once that has been done, then we have performance measurement, which then comes in to measure how well we are implementing our business processes, that is our standard operating procedures or SOPs, and then also the policies and procedures, because again, you can never know how well you're implementing something or how well you're performing at a particular, say for example, when we're looking at compliance, compliance to regulation. So you want to know like how well are we complying to, say for example, the data protection law, or the data protection act of 2019. So how well are we complying against this? Only way you can do that is if you do performance measurement. So governance is basically concerned with coming up with the strategic direction of the organization, coming up with processes that are going to build up into making sure that the strategy is achieved, cascading this strategy down into the different departments of the organization. And then after that, actually being in charge of performance measurement to make sure that at the end of these 5 years, we're not coming back only to find that we had a strategy that we never implemented. We have to have checks at every point of our journey in implementing the strategy. Right. So that is as far as governance is concerned. Now, going into risk management is just risk management. And we're going to look at that further when we go down and get into the section that really talks about risk management. Because we find that risk management really just involves you having a risk management framework, coming up with a risk assessment methodology that is acceptable and approved in the organization, and then using this across all departments to conduct a risk assessment. However, you find that some different departments may adopt a different methodology for conducting risk assessments. And again, this will depend with the framework the organization is adopting. And then lastly, we have compliance. So compliance is the arm of GRC that is basically concerned with, it's like the police, making sure that whatever it is we've said we're going to do is actually implemented. And compliance is very key because, again, number one, most of the times you're looking at compliance internally and also externally. Now, compliance will be forced by the environment we operate in, because, you know, a business does not just operate in its own bubble, operates in a country that has a government, has a constitution, that has it's in an industry that is basically regulated, has regulators. If it's an insurance company, it's regulated by who's the regulator for insurance? IRA. If you're looking at SACCOs, you have SASRA. If you're looking at a bank, you have the Central Bank of Kenya, and so on and so forth. So that is from the external perspective. Again, from the internal perspective, you have people who are independent of the implementation or of the operations of the organization, and this will be the audit arm of the organization. And they will basically conduct an audit against our own business processes, against our own policies and procedures. If you're looking at an organization that is certified for, say, for example, a quality management system that is ISO 9001, or a business that is certified against business continuity management system that is 22301, by nature of their operations, then again, an audit will come back to audit to basically check how well the organization is complying against the requirements of the standards which we have chosen to get certified against. So basically, compliance makes sure that whatever it is has been agreed upon in the governance section has been implemented. Okay. So looking at governance, so we find that number one, we have document processes and risks, then define and document controls, the controls that are going to make sure that we basically achieve the strategic objectives, then assess the effectiveness of these controls, disclosure and certification of compliance processes, and then remediate issues that may arise as far as our information or rather risk assessment is concerned, issues that may arise as part of the results of the audit that is conducted by the compliance arm. Then risk management is concerned with identification of risk, risk analysis, identification of mitigation measures for these risks, could be accepting, treating a risk, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, report on containment of the said risks. And then compliance, which again is, as we said, the police that makes sure that indeed we are compliant to what we are expected to comply to, because again, if you do not comply to regulations, there is a repercussion. If you do not comply to your policies and procedures, there is a repercussion. And all this winds back to our strategy, our business objectives, our mission, and our vision as an organization, that is. Okay. So starting with governance, basically, as you've already said, is just looking at an organization wholesomely. And here basically is the role, majorly the role of top management and senior management, where they sit down and agree on, come up with, go on a retreat somewhere, come up with a strategy, make sure it's implemented, approve policies and procedures, and then again be in charge of performance measurement of the implementation of these controls that are going to make sure that we achieve our business, our strategic objectives. Okay. So going down into risk management. So according to ISO 31000, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. ISO 31000 is a widely known standard for implementation of an enterprise risk management framework for any organization that is intent about and keen about implementing a risk management framework. So basically, it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So that means you have to have set your objectives, identified where you intend to go in 5-10 years plan, 10 years, and then also try to see what could come in the way of you achieving your objectives. And now that becomes the risk. Risks could be introduced by the environment that we are in, that is in terms of the political environment. It could be also the climate, could also be the social environment that the business operates in, and so on and so forth. So basically, risk management is looking at the objectives that we intend to achieve, all the risks that pose significant threats to us achieving these particular objectives, and then making sure that we treat these risks before they actually materialize, and make sure that we don't, or rather hinder us from attaining our objectives, basically. Okay. So again, looking at risk management and creation of value. So the whole purpose of risk management is to actually make sure that we are creating and protecting value. Remember, an organization has it has specific stakeholders that are interested in it. We have our customers, we have shareholders, we have staff who work there. So basically, when you look at a enterprise risk management framework, it is geared towards making sure that each and every stakeholder is happy, and that their needs are well addressed, and that anything that comes in the way to take away from us making sure that the stakeholders are happy, then we address those. So risk management improves performance and encourages innovation and supports the achievement of objectives. So as you can see here, we have this rat. It would like to eat some food here. It knows that, however, the minute it steps on this, it will probably get hurt. But then again, it's something that it needs to do, but it has to do so carefully. It doesn't mean that approaches the food carelessly. So what does it do? Probably gets a helmet, so that even if it gets hit, it really won't get hurt per se. So that is more like what risk management is all about, making sure that risks do not stop you from actually going towards your objective. They shouldn't stop you from going towards your objectives. But even then, you make sure that you have the necessary controls, you have the necessary treatment options that have been implemented to make sure that the said risks do not materialize in our quest to achieve our objectives. Okay, so and then here is an example looking at Julius Yego. And then again, we have a very recent example of the Ineos guy. What is his name? Anyway, I
Elliot
forgot. Yes, sorry.
Kipchoge.
Yes, Eliud
Kipchoge.
Kipchoge. That's the guy I was looking for. So basically looking at what he did, and then also what Julius Yego did, because he was the first person. We had never had anyone in our country, actually even in Africa, participate in javelin. But then again, he did, and he won. He won the cup in that particular season. So basically, this is him making sure that he looks at his current situation and the goal, which is to win the cup, right? But his current situation, he's very disadvantaged and does not have the necessary resources around him to actually achieve what he would like to achieve, which is winning the cup. So what does he do? He will get, number one, a trainer. Now, this is the resources that he needs. So we have a trainer, someone who's well versed with this game, someone who understands the rules, someone who understands the kind of build his body needs to be in for him to actually win the, say, championships. And then again, apart from now getting the trainer, they need processes. What shall we do? What is our routine like? What kind of diet are we putting you on? Do you need maybe to go to the gym? What muscles do you need to exercise most, and so on and so forth? That becomes his process. That is a day-to-day thing that is carried out repeatedly to make sure that we achieve our objectives. And then last but not least, any process for it to be implemented effectively and for it to be repeatable and for it to be effective, then needs to be automated. It's fine, you can go the manual way. Even when you look at, say, for example, HR, the HR department, human resources and admin, right? They can manage their files manually. So they can have lockers where they keep staff files and payroll data and so on and so forth. But that is so cumbersome. That process is prone to errors and so on and so forth. But when you adopt a system to automate this process, and that means basically increases the effectiveness or efficiency of this process and reduces errors and makes sure that we actually get to our goal even faster. So apart from people and processes, then you have technology, which you then implement, that is going to push you or steer you even closer to your objective. Okay, so and I think Eliud employed this very well, because like he had this sort of formation that was running in front of him, and then he had this car that was basically measuring his speed and telling him when he needs to slow down, when he needs to hurry up, and so on and so forth. That is the power of technology. Yeah. So that's basically all about risk and its effect on uncertainty. So balancing risks then means that, number one, we need to be able to understand our risk appetite. Just how much are we willing to stomach? How much is an organization willing to accept? Now, these are some of the things that you think about even after you have a strategy, which is fine. But then in our case, to achieve this strategy, just how much risk are we willing to achieve to take? Whatever risk we're not willing to take, we basically bench it and we work with whatever it is that is palatable for us. So that becomes our risk appetite. And then again, we also have risk capacity. That is the amount and type of risk that an organization can support in pursuit of its business objectives. Then we have the residual risk that remains after you treat your risks. And then we have risk acceptance, which is basically looking at some strategic objective that we have to achieve. And we can see a lot of risks that are kind of standing in the way for us, in the way of us achieving this particular objective, but we still forge ahead and basically make sure that we achieve the objective regardless of the said risks. So that becomes risk acceptance. Okay, so some of the principles of risk management include number one, integration. So it has to be integrated across the entire organization. It cannot be something that only one department in the organization is concerned with, say for example, finance, because probably they deal with money and they need to exercise risk. No, it's something that's supposed to be the culture of the entire organization. Then number two, it needs to be structured and comprehensive so that you can achieve comprehensive results. And that is why I talked about initially having a risk management framework and a methodology that is standard and applicable across the entire organization. Then again, needs to be customized. Whatever it is works for organization A won't necessarily work for organization B. So it's very important to sit down and look at the risk assessment methodology that we choose. How do we treat risks, or rather, how do we accept risks? What do we determine to be a high risk? For some people, losing, for example, looking at the impact of losing 1,000,000 shillings, for an organization A, that could be a very high risk that we can't afford to lose 1,000,000 shillings. But then when you look at someone like a bank, for them a high risk is if they lose, like, say half a billion shillings, something of that sort, because they've already calculated their risks appetite and they understand the nature of their business. And therefore, it has to be, your risk methodology cannot just be lifted from this organization and applied to you. It has to be customized to the risk appetite of the organization, to the nature and business of the organization. Some people don't even have legal requirements per se. So then again, some of those impacts won't even apply to them. Then it needs to be inclusive, needs to be dynamic, has to change with times. If your risk assessment methodology was not at any one point looking at a risk such as a black swan, like like the COVID-19 that just happened recently, then that means you need to come back and relook at your methodology and look at the universe of your risks, because then again, now this becomes something that is possible. It can actually happen to us. So we need to rethink our methodology and our risk appetite. Okay, then best available information. So you have to use the information that you have at your disposal to basically make sure that your risk methodology is very sound and it speaks to your business processes. Then again, you have to think about the human and cultural factors, the people who work in your organization, the culture of the market within which your business operates in, and so on and so forth. And then last but not least, which is very critical and important, is making sure that we achieve continual improvement. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the most important thing is to start and then improve our methodology over time. And even looking at our risk management process, if we identify risks and we set them up for treatment, we make sure we treat these risks so that we come back and make sure that we're identifying any other risks that are standing in the way of us achieving our strategic objectives. So what would be the benefit of effective risk management? Would be reduced downtime, reputation management, operational excellence, because now you have repeatable processes, optimize customer experience, compliance management, and then lastly, supply chain resilience, just to mention a few. Okay. So this is how the risk management process normally is like. So number one, you need to establish the context. And by establishing the context is to sit down and ask yourself, who's SheHacks? What does SheHacks do basically? Why do we exist in the first place? What is our strategy? What is our mission? What is our vision? Who are the people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis? Who are our stakeholders? What are their needs and expectations from us? So that is establishing the context and understanding who you are, the environment you operate in. Some people go as far as, it's actually not some people, you are encouraged to go as far as conducting either a SWOT analysis, that is strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or even conducting the PESTEL, the one that looks at political, economic, social, and all that. Basically, adopt something that is going to make you look at yourself wholesomely as an organization to establish the context of who we are. And then after that, we identify risks that might present themselves due to the nature of who we are and the market we operate in, people we interact with, the technologies we adopt to automate our processes, and so on and so forth. After we identify the risks, then we analyze them. And then this analysis is going to be informed by the methodology that we chose. So the methodology normally speaks about how do you identify risks. So risk identification could be in very many ways, could be due to some incident that was reported by staff, could be due to a complaint from a customer, could be due to an internal process to actually identify risks, and so on and so forth. Then how do you analyze risk? You have to look at the likelihood of the risk materializing, compare this with the impact of the risk if it were to materialize, and then you would have the you would now have the outcome of the risk, which will then guide you to knowing how you would want to treat the risk. So you conduct risk evaluation. In risk evaluation, this basically means the organization sits down and looks at, number one, do you want to treat this risk? Do you want to terminate it? Do you want to transfer it, say, to a third party, to an insurance provider? Or do you want to have a merger, for example? Okay. Or lastly, treat, terminate, transfer, or accept the risk, tolerate it. Okay, so those are the four options. After you evaluate the risks, then you come and say, for example, if you've chosen to treat the risk, we treat the risk to reduce the impact and likelihood. We can either reduce the impact of the risk or the likelihood of the risk materializing. And then after all that is said and done, we do monitoring and review to make sure that the risk does not, again, the vulnerability does not basically increase the risk, and then we have to start the process again. Right. So that is, in summary, the risk management process. Now, how then does governance come into play when you're looking at the risk management process? So, number one, when we're looking at risk management, as you said, we have four options when it comes to evaluation of risks. So it could be modification, which is treatment. So you need to identify what is making risk increase. So for example, let's say we're looking at risk of data loss due to, say, for example, use of hard copy documentation, which is basically exposed to, say, for example, the building can catch fire or something of that sort, okay? So if you want to treat that risk, then what do? We basically say, instead of having hard copy documentation, we shall scan these documents and then upload them into a DMS, that's the document management system. And just like that, we've basically reduced this vulnerability of having documents in hard copy. So that means now our documents are in soft copy and we are no longer worried about fire coming to destroy the said documents. Then risk retention is when you look at a risk and decide that looking at how much it will cost me to actually treat the risk, I would rather sit with this risk. Yeah, so that means you actually tolerate or accept the risk. And then risk avoidance is looking at that process that is using hard copy documents and the risk it introduces us to, and asking yourself, do we actually need it? Is it something we can do without? If yes, then you completely get, or rather do away with it. So that's risk avoidance. And then lastly, we have risk sharing, where we are saying, okay, so we accept that our documents are sitting in hard copy. In the event of a fire, let's transfer this risk and basically insure these documents, or rather insure this particular section, and make sure that we have someone to help us recover in the event of this risk materializing. Now, as you can imagine, that is just a very small example. Sometimes you have risks that are very critical, and this we are looking at things such as disaster recovery options for the organization, okay? So we have our setup in our primary site. The organization has the strategic objective to basically implement teammates and automate the audit management process, for example. That has been done, we're in the process. And then one day we wake up and the database, SQL database for teammates, all of a sudden is not available, and there's no way to bring it back, and we didn't have backups, okay? So now this organization did not have a disaster recovery plan. And then again, having a disaster recovery plan to treat such a risk is expensive. You guys know that technology infrastructure is expensive, right? So to have a disaster recovery site or a secondary site, which is basically a replication of your primary site, can be expensive, can be an expensive affair. And also doing backups that will enable us to recover, say, for example, the last data, like the very most recent data before the incident happened, like allow us to recover up to like the last minute of when we lost this data, means that we will have to implement something such as replication, for example, real-time replication using Vim backup or whatever, for us to be able to achieve that level of recovery time objective. So these are technologies that are expensive. Having a secondary site is an expensive affair. So when you look at a risk assessment and you come up with treatment options that then we have said this is what we want to implement to treat these risks, you definitely cannot, as the person who've been assigned the risk, as the risk owner, cannot just say, okay, so this is what we are going with, and then present your financials to finance and say that I want this and this and this. You cannot make such decisions. And that is where top management comes in. Whatever risk treatment option we have adopted has to be approved by senior management. Yeah. So those decisions, in as much as someone in the organization, say, for example, if a risk affects the HR department, then definitely the HRM would be made the risk owner. But that does not mean that they are the ones to make the final decision in as far as these risks are concerned. It is for this to be presented to senior management for them to determine how much or how heavily does this risk affect our strategic objectives. If it does, then that means it's something that we need to prioritize and put in the budget for next year. So that becomes a decision that is made by senior management. Then again, the other thing is in terms of accepting the residual risk. So once you conduct a risk assessment, you're going to identify treatment options. So you say, for example, we are exposed to risk of ransomware because we do not have an antivirus, right? So what do? We are going to buy Bitdefender. We're going to buy Kaspersky. We're going to buy whatever it is, have fancy antivirus, endpoint antivirus we have out here. So that becomes the control to treat the saved risks. Once you have these, implement these controls to treat the risks, there is a residual risk that remains because the rules on the antivirus may not, maybe say, for example, be 100% well implemented to make sure that there is no malware that actually penetrates in the network, because new strains of malware are created every other day. So that whatever little risk remains is the residual risk. Again, whatever it is that goes into the register as the residual risk is not the role of the risk owner to accept. It's the role of top management to accept. Reason being, the residual risk could be, again, something that the risk owner may overlook in terms of, okay, so the residual risk, we do not need to treat it any further. But then again, when it is presented to top management and they determine that it indeed is it still poses some threats to us achieving our strategic objectives, then they might come back and say, you know what, we still need to further treat the residual risk. So then again, it is the role of top management to actually approve the residual risks that we decide not to treat. Okay. And then lastly, we have compliance. So for compliance, it's basically, as we already mentioned, it's concerned with identifying the applicable requirements, that is the laws and regulations of the land, of the business that are very relevant. And then after doing that, we assess the state of compliance. So what you would normally find is that an organization has it has a repository of all the applicable laws and regulations, and then it will look at this. Someone is charged, especially looking at the compliance of the legal department, looking at this compliance repository, and first of all, determining how often do we need to comply to these regulations. Maybe we expected to publish a report quarterly and it is sent to this organization. We're expected to do this other thing on a yearly basis. We're expected to, in the case of banks, they're expected to report incidents as soon as they happen, report incidents to the Central Bank of Kenya, and so on and so forth. So then that is assessing the state of compliance, how well we are actually achieving them. And then lastly, we have assessed the risks and potential cost of non-compliance against projected expenses to achieve compliance. Yeah. So what is the implication to say Mueni Bank or whatever, Bank ABC, to them not complying to the regulations of the CBK? Of course, they lose their license to operate. So what does this mean to Bank ABC? Is this something they are willing to take? Of course not. So we are better off complying to these requirements. So you come back and say, okay, so what do these regulations actually require me to do? Make sure that this is actually implemented. Then again, sometimes the cost of actually complying to these requirements could be very high. Yeah. So the organization again has to sit down and look at, according to their risk appetite, what is our risk appetite like? Are we willing to comply to these requirements? If there's something we expected to pay, like a fee we expected to pay every other quarter or year or even month, is it something we are willing to take, looking at our strategic objectives and what we intend to achieve? So that is the whole point of compliance. And as you already mentioned, it can be achieved looking at, number one, internally ourselves, conducting internal audits, again, by an independent department, just looking at how well we're implementing our policies, the procedures, and how well we are complying to the requirements of regulators and so on and so forth. And then again, having external audits. External audits could be forced by the regulator, and then again could be required by your clients Yeah, so you have a customer who maybe wants to have very critical interactions with you that will mean them giving you their client data and customer data and very confidential PII. So what does it mean? The client wants to get that level of assurance that indeed this organization has implemented adequate controls to give me satisfaction that they're going to protect the data that I entrust them with. And therefore, a client can also call for an audit for an organization prior to entering into a contract with them. Then again, an external audit could also be if you've implemented a framework or a standard that you need to actually comply with, the certification body will will send external auditors to come and audit you every other year to make sure that you're complying with the said standard, because by virtue of you being certified against such a standard, then that means that it gives you some level of prestige and some level of competitive advantage in the market. And therefore you have to comply with the requirements of the said standard, or basically lose your certification. So that's just a very brief example looking at compliance. So in summary, what then is the interdependence between governance, risk, and compliance? So governance, as you already said, it addresses strategic planning, business processes and alignment, policy creation and vision setting, yeah? And then compliance, adherence to laws, regulations, policies and standards and best practice. Then risk is basically addressing system threats, system vulnerabilities, protection of IT assets, risk to management objectives, and so on and so forth, right? So first of all, you see that compliance, so starting with compliance, compliance makes sure that we are complying with the governance rules that have already been set up here. Okay, so the policies, the business processes, the SOPs, and so on. And then governance, on the other hand, will make sure who decides and the processes to follow as far as compliance is concerned. So what are the regulations? What is the best channel to use to satisfy the requirements of the ABCD and so on and so forth. On the other hand, between governance and risk, for governance, basically is looking at the risk trade-off decisions. As you already said, is this risk worth taking? Is this a risk I want to treat because it affects my business significantly? Then yes, definitely let me think about how to treat it. And then again, we have risk tolerance rules. And then for compliance and risks, yeah, we're looking at what is the impact of me not complying, and then determining if it's something I really want to do. Of course not. So then forces us to come back and look at our compliance requirements and make sure that they are actually implemented and achieved. Right. So that's it. Brings me to the end of this discussion. I hope it wasn't very long. Try to keep it 30 minutes short. Back to you, if.
Thank you, Faith. I believe we've learned so much from it. And it was quite simple, and you broke it down for us really well. Maybe does anyone else have a question or anything you could ask for answers for?
If there's a question in the chat.
Okay. Okay, this is from Sheila Amolo. It says, for organizations that rely on external audits, what would you say comprises of a comprehensive external audit for SACCOs and banks? And especially where an external regulator wants to ensure the said organization has put in place proper controls. Maybe to you, Faith.
All right. So so for organizations that rely on external audits, what would you say comprises a comprehensive external audit for SACCOs and banks, specifically for SACCOs and banks, especially where an external regulator wants to ensure that the said organization has put in place proper controls? All right, great. So number one, an external audit, and especially the one that is mandated by the regulator, will almost always have a scope. And majority of the time, the scope is around the core banking system or the core processing system that basically is the system that handles finances, yeah? So that will probably be the scope, that the scope will be very clear from the regulator. But then apart from that, apart from what, say, for example, SASRA would expect of a SACCO as far as protection of monies is concerned, and proving that these monies are adequately protected, an organization, a SACCO, can actually conduct a system, or rather an organization-wide information systems audit that is geared towards identifying weakness in controls that could basically lead to compromise of the core banking system. So say, for example, you're looking at an audit where you want to see what are the minimum security baselines that have been implemented on the Active Directory, because let's say SACCO implements authentication through a domain controller. So weaknesses in authentication controls on the domain controller could eventually be used by an attacker to go all the way into the core banking system. So I would say that at any one given point, an organization needs to make sure that at least annually you conduct as an organization-wide or an enterprise-wide audit. And organizations, most organizations sometimes actually integrate an information systems audit with a financial audit, where you would have a consultant such as PKF or whatever conducting a financial audit. Then you have another organization, or rather the same organization also doing an information systems audit that is going to then basically give you a very clear picture of the status of the internal controls that have been implemented, and how this affects your standing with the regulator. Because remember, like, it's a requirement for, say, SACCOs to conduct these audits and present these reports to the SACCO. So it's in the to SASRA rather. So it's in the best interest of the organization to make sure that these audit issues have been identified, and then you identify the treatment options and show the plan to implement them even before you present the report to the regulator. Reason being, of course, it's going to be something that determines how you're rating as a SACCO and your trustworthiness. I don't know if I've answered your question adequately, Sheila.
Sheila says, for some that I've seen, they seem to omit mobile security, yet they use mobile applications, or this doesn't apply to all.
Okay, so again, as I mentioned, the scope might be very specific coming from the regulator, but then again, it is upon the organization itself looking at, forget the regulator. Remember, this is an organization that has its own stakeholders that are interested in the success of the organization. So you need to look at all the sources or all the channels that are used in the transaction, in transactions by customers, be it internet banking and mobile banking, even the USSD applications. All of those basically need to be assessed in the audit cycle in a year to make sure that vulnerabilities have been identified and that they have been remediated. So I think, in as much as it may not actually be a requirement that comes from the regulator, it's also very, very important for you to take the initiative and basically do such an assessment. And if, Sheila, you ever find yourself in such a situation, it's actually upon you to better advise the client, or rather advise the said SACCO or the bank why or how it would benefit them, for them to look at all their channels, not only concentrating on the core banking system, but then looking at all the integrating systems and how vulnerabilities may be propagated from those systems and affect the core banking system.
That's great. Lucy Kiru says she's interested in GRC and she's curious what your day-to-day activities involve at at Sentinel, and whether you're involved in all three aspects of GRC, or are specialized, or you're specialized in one area.
So are you involved in all three aspects? I wonder if it's me as Mueni or the organization. So as the organization in general, yes. So we are involved in all three aspects of the GRC metrics, that is in governance. And as far as any organization that is interested in actually coming up with, or rather help with coming up with a strategy, that, and especially looking at the cybersecurity strategy, not the organization-wide strategy, not the IT strategy, but the organization-wide, or rather the cybersecurity strategy that supports implementation of sound security controls. Yeah. So looking at how we can help an organization to actually come up with a strategy and even implement it, and then again policies and procedures and so on and so forth. Then again, enterprise risk management, we have an entire department that deals with enterprise risk management and business and continuity. And then of course compliance. Myself, I'm a lead pen tester. I also do audits, so making sure that organizations are complying with regulations. I hope that answers your question, Lucy.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome.
I have one more question.
Okay.
I'm curious about the certifications, or okay, how do I switch to GRC? I'm currently working as information security consultant, but I'm more into deploying antiviruses.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I make that switch? Is it certifications, or what kind of certifications do I need to do? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think let me answer this question, and I would also like to invite maybe Laura or Eve to also comment on it, because I think something that comes up a lot in SheHacks boot camps, where basically there's a concern of then how do I make that switch, as you're saying. But for me, I normally say that certifications are nothing if you really do not have anything to back it up with as far as experience is concerned. So certifications are good and all on paper, yes, but your worth is actually proven when you sit down to actually doing the job. Okay, so I think you should only worry about number one, finding an organization, or rather switching to a department that will make sure that you build the relevant skills that you are interested in the GRC metrics. Maybe you'd want to move into information systems auditing and training, or vulnerability assessment and pen testing, or even implementing frameworks, whatever it is that you're interested in. Maybe first move into such an organization or a department that is doing these things actively, get to understand them. You could be surprised once you get there, find that it's actually something that you're not so much interested in after all, and it becomes something that you learn and you continue to move on as you search for where you want to actually settle. So first, gain the experience, give it at least 6 months, a year actively doing the job, and then find relevant certifications. What I normally say is you don't have to start with like the small certifications, say for example, for auditing, you can actually aim to go all the way, or for information security certifications, you can aim to go all the way to a certification such as CISSP without necessarily having to do a smaller audit, or rather an easier audit certification. So build the experience and then look for a certification that is going to be prestigious, that is going to make you stand out apart from your experience. It's going to make you stand out with your peers. It's going to make you look competent and actually prove that you are indeed, competent in your area, and then you'll be good. Otherwise, starting with a certification and then coming to do the job may not really be the best approach. I don't know what you think, Laura or Eve.
Does anyone else have a question? Or
If we're talking about certifications,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
yeah, let's say I think everything Winnie has said is actually on point. It all depends on you as an individual. Sometimes you might have the paper, but the organizations are looking for the skills, while some organizations are bureaucratic in that they look at paper more, not really more than the skills, but they look at the papers. And so it totally depends on what path you want to take, and also what like which organizations you want to go into. If it's banks, I'm sure I'm not so sure about all the banks, but I do know some banks that require some sort of certification for you to get a job there, and not only banks but some organizations as well. So it all depends on a number of different factors.
Awesome.
Constantine is asking, do you continually track vulnerabilities that come up during audits, or do you have to wait till the next audit cycle?
Okay. So as far as vulnerability tracking is concerned, I think it has to be a continuous process. It has to be something that is conducted on a day-to-day basis, um, in line with what we've been discussing, which is making sure that we adopt a risk-aware culture. So say, for example, in June 2020, we conduct a vulnerability assessment that combines this with our information systems audit. There are recommendations that we need to take. Again, out of the vulnerability assessment, there are remediation steps to treat these issues to do with patching, these issues to do with, say, for example, encryption and ciphers that we're using for encryption in the organization. So we cannot sit and wait until the next audit, which probably would be in June 2021, to conduct a subsequent assessment to see how well these have been done. But then again, it is very important to have, how you have a red versus blue team in the organization. You need to have a team that is consistently charged with implementing, and another team is actually checking to make sure that indeed whatever it is was found out has actually been treated. I think it's something that an organization needs to build towards. Of course, we can begin with number one, having an external audit coming to do and identify these vulnerabilities. Then they are assigned to specific people who are responsible for the implementation and remediation of those issues. And then after that, basically retest internally before the next audit cycle, just so that, again, it shows proactiveness from the organization, that we are not just depending on a third party to come and tell us how to live, but then again, we are people who are aware of these cybersecurity risks, and we are taking a proactive approach towards, assessing our risks and treating them, assessing our vulnerabilities and treating them before they are taken advantage of. And even after that, we are even confident enough to invite an external person to come and give us their view. Cool. All right. Back to you then, Laura. Eve also.
Thank you so much, Faith. Yes, I do agree with what you said, Sharon. Sharon, the best practice is to track the vulnerabilities uncovered during audit to closure. Aside from annual audit reviews, it's good to have an effective patch and vulnerability management program for continuous review of vulnerabilities and closure in the environment. Same thing Wendy has said. Thank you. This has been so inspiring. I always love your talk, Faith, and I'm glad you got to do one again this year after Hackfest last year. So thank you for that. Yeah, this has been insightful. Eve, do you have anything to say?
Not much, really. Thank you, Faith. It's been a great session. At least you've taken us back to the class of GRC, as it was something I used to do before, but nowadays I just focus on pen testing. So thank you. It was quite insightful, and I believe the attendees have enjoyed it, as I've seen on the comment section. Nothing more from me, only that. Thank you, everyone, for attending the session, and have a good night. And good morning for some of us there.
Good night, people. Good morning, Eve. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.